Sound of Gold on the Terry Knight Show. Bobby goes for
Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name's Jeff Krulik, and I've been obsessed with rock and roll history in the Washington, Maryland, Virginia area for quite some time. I grew up here and started going to concerts, of course, at the Capitol Center. But I was always curious about like what came before this, machinery, this concert industry. What we have here is a chance to meet really the founding fathers, in my opinion, of what is now a business, something that's, at least locally here. On the edge of the panel here, the, what is this, far left, we have somebody I'm really thrilled to have as a participant. And his name's Durwood Settles. He was a presence here. He was the main promoter in the 1960s, and I really thank you for being here, a part of this. Durwood C. Settles. Teddy Bodnar is next to him. Teddy did shows at the Elks Club on Route 50 and out in Fairfax, and worked with many, many local bands in the 1960s. Also had his own recording studio, American Star Recording in Merrifield, and so he was right there in the bringing acts, local and national, to this region. Michael Oberman, you now know his work as nature photography. He's one of the preeminent photographers in this region, but in the 60s, he ran the teen scene column in the Washington Star, which was the place where people went to find out what was happening and going on in this area. And also managed the band Claude Jones and many other, I think you even worked for Cellar Door at the beginning. So, and next to him, Mike Schreibman, still active in the business, running the Washington Area Musicians Association, WAMA. Whammy's coming up in February, and he's still active, involved. I used to go to his concerts. I'm sure many of you did too. New Era concerts and New Era Follies, among many other businesses running shows. To my left, immediate left, Bud Becker. When we first met, I spent about 8 hours with him, and we still didn't cover everything. Bud's been involved from the 60s to the present. You name it, he's been there. Domestic Sound Productions out of Falls Church, Hammerjacks. I'm sure many, many other things he can tell you about. Right now, I would like to just turn it over to them. They're all seeing each other, in some cases for the first time in years, so you're witnessing a reunion. And I think, really, Durwood, how, if you could just maybe each of you come down, start there and come down, just say a few words, maybe talk a little bit more about beyond this introduction I gave you.
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. First off, I'm from Arlington, Virginia, and so for being here is really kind of a pleasure, because most folks, when you go off from Arlington, you say, well, I'm from Washington, D.C., but I'm from Arlington. And so Northern Virginia is the focus of this, but we did our things in Washington as well. I got into the concert business after college in New York City. And I started in 1966 working in Central Park at the Rheingold Central Park Music Festival, where virtually every new popular act and some traditional acts were booked and played throughout the entire summer for $1 a ticket. And I did that for 2 summers before I decided to come back to Washington, to Arlington, Washington, if you will, in 1967, where I embarked on put my foot in the entrepreneurial toe, so to speak, into promoting concerts here in Washington. And so my first concert really was in 1967 at the Washington Hilton Ballroom, and it was a jazz show with Dionne Warwick and Cannonball Adderley and Oscar Brown Jr., with a name you all might know, Petey Green, as a comedian on the bill, who had just gotten out of Lorton Reformatory. And that's where I met him in 1967. And and he was a friend of mine until the day he died, one of my best friends, actually. And so starting with me is sort of late in the 60s because I promoted in the late 60s until the early 70s or early 1971, if you will. And I came to Washington with, after doing all these shows in New York, with lots of connections, the same connections these people have, but a lot of them were, face-to-face connections, handshake connections. I'd see them, coming and going every day. So I had very good access to artists, and I came just at a time when the market sort of opened up for promoters to do independent concerts because of certain factors such as, and I don't want to step on anybody's stories here, but the Felds, who did so many concerts, purchased a circus in 1966 or 67, and they then proceeded to create two circuses, which then basically occupied all their time, and they didn't do any more concerts.
That they didn't really like the music
And they also were known to say, we don't like the music, and therefore declined to promote these concerts.
These were the Felds, who now own the circus and had Super Attractions, right?
Super Attractions, they operated out of the Super Music City stores, and they operated the Carter Barron Amphitheater, and they were the first promoters in Washington, in fact in the United States, to promote the Beatles in concert. They're the ones that you see the Beatles getting off the train at Union Station, and they were greeted there, I'm sure, and escorted to their concert at then Uline Arena. And so they were truly big-time promoters for what it was at that time.
I believe they did the Buddy Holly tour, the ill-fated Buddy Holly tour.
I did not know that, but I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we can talk more
Anyway,
about
yes,
many
and
artists.
so we can embellish any of this. I don't want to occupy it all the time. So, Teddy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ted Bodnar. I started in the music business in 1960. I was only 16 years old. And I met Link Ray and Ray Vernon, and they had a recording studio downtown, and I started working with them. They taught me a lot about engineering, and then Ray would turn most of it over to me. And then I started promoting in 1965 at the Elks Club. And back then, you could buy acts at a price where you could actually promote and make money. It was a small venue. I think the actual, you only allowed 800 people, but we always put 1,400 in. And which this is an interesting story. No matter who I brought in, I had the association. I used to go to New York up to an agency up there every week, and I would pick. They would play me all the new stuff they have coming in, and I would try to pick far enough in advance a record that I thought was going to be a hit and then book that act. I bought the association for $500 about a month and a half or 2 months before Along Came Mary came out. When they hit my place, Along Came Mary was #1. But even with that type of thing, the actual biggest shows we ever had was some of the local groups. The Fallen Angels put so many people in the Elks Club that I had to pay to have the walls fixed downstairs because they cracked the walls. So I promoted there for 3 years, and we did it every other week for 3 years, and tickets were $2 to $5 depending on who I had. And I also promoted on the Wilson Line. I don't know how many people remember the Wilson Line. It was a boat that went from Washington D.C. to Marshall Hall, and I did a lot of R&B on there. Wilson Pickett, different things, and that was very successful too. I never had a show in either location where I lost money. I made money on every single show I ever did. But then, as he was saying, the acts became so much money. You had to have the Capitol Center to make any money, and I went off and built a recording studio and just stopped promoting.
Mike, right?
Hi, I'm Michael Oberman, and I guess my interest in music and writing came from originally my brother, who was a writer at the Washington Star. And when I was 16, I became a copy boy at the Star. And my brother was one of the first American journalists to interview the Beatles. And when I saw how many girls he was meeting, I said, when he leaves that job, I'm getting it. So at age 19, when I was still in journalism school at the University of Maryland, I took over the column in the Washington Star, and for 6 years did 300 interviews. Did you have to do your brother in? My brother had moved to Chicago to work for Mercury Records at the time, and over the 6-year period, I interviewed The Doors, Janis Joplin, Otis Redding, you name it. I've got a list here if anyone wants to see the 300 interviews, which my brother and I are compiling a book now because he wrote the column for 3 years and I wrote it for 6 years. So we have 500 interviews to pick from. During the time I was at the Star, I discovered hippiedom also, and the Star was a rather conservative newspaper. And I had my hair growing down my back, and I would bring my German Shepherd into work with me. And eventually I started managing artists while I was still at the Star. And one of the acts, Claude Jones, we had a farm between Warrenton and Culpeper, and they were kind of darlings, kind of the hippie darlings of the Washington scene. And I've got a funny story. David Bowie spent his first night in the United States in 1971 at my mother's house in Silver Spring, Maryland. And we went to the airport. My brother was working with Bowie at the time, and I was writing this column, and we went to pick him up at Dulles Airport. We waited 4 hours because he had been in a full-length purple gown on the plane, so customs really wanted to do the twice over on him. We took him, my parents, my brother, and I took David Bowie. He had never set foot in the United States before, to Emerson's Steakhouse in Silver Spring, where the waitress promptly put us in a booth with curtains and closed the curtains on us. Later that night, I lived in Tacoma Park. Bowie came back from my parents' house to my place in Tacoma Park, and I was managing 2 acts, Claude Jones and Sky Cobb. And Sky Cobb was at my house having, well, there are former policemen here. Are there any current policemen here? They were having a bong contest. And David Bowie had never seen a bong in his life. And these guys from Sky Cobb, who considered themselves kind of like the band, hippie band, and looked at this British guy with long hair and the clothes he was wearing, and they didn't say a word to him. To this day, Marcus Cuff, who was a preeminent photographer on the West Coast and was the drummer in Sky Cobb, and then went on to be the drummer in Emmylou Harris's Angel Band, and he and I are friends through photography now. To this day, he says, I can't believe we spent the evening with David Bowie and didn't say a word to him. I'll pass the mic now to my friend Mike Schreibman.
Is he here? Well, I started working in entertainment when I was still in high school. I had a friend who was a folk singer, and I started helping him get work, and after I got out of high school, we got him dates up and down the East Coast, and from there I worked at some clubs, and then I started promoting shows in '68 after having worked at the Ambassador Theater, which was Washington's rock theater. And my first show was at Meriwether Post with Country Joe and the Fish and Iron Butterfly, and we did quite well on that show, and I was encouraged to continue in the business. But my next show was a big flop. It was Ramsey Lewis and Cannonball Adderley at Constitution Hall. And I was pretty naive in the business at that point, and I used to go to Durwood and ask him about how you do this and how you do that. And I don't think Durwood was that happy to give me information. But I thought we were doing 2 shows, and I had a lot of tickets that I didn't expect to sell. So I thought I would give them out, give them to people who couldn't afford them. And that night I learned my first lesson, which was all those people were out front selling their tickets. And then I continued on in the business, working in other clubs and then promoting concerts till just about the present day.
Here, bud.
Am I here? Wow. My life spans everybody in this room. Feel like I've touched everybody. They've touched me. I'll start, if I will. Let me start with Teddy. came down in the Army. I was a Fort Myers person, and landed here in the end of 64, start of 65, and had a little AM radio, and used to tune in J.A. the DJ. It was on Weem, and that's how I first heard about the Elks Lodge shows. And I really didn't know Teddy at that time. We became friends, good friends. After that, he had the recording studio and so on. But the shows and Jack made a first impression on me. And through that, I started, long story, but I started working with Giant Music in Arlington, Virginia, and Falls Church. And Jack was the spokesperson for the stores, which were owned by a guy named Jack Schaefer. So it was Jack Alex for Jack Schaefer's Giant Music. And they wanted to get into the music business of selling equipment. And the problem was Fender, which was the main line for most of the rock, local rock bands in the early 60s. Washington Music had the exclusive franchise on that. And Jack Schaefer had Ampeg and Gibson to work with. So what happened, evolved from that, is I formed a booking agency because I had connection with local bands through Giant Music. I'd seen what was going on. And the idea was they tagged their radio spots with, if you want to book a band, call Giant Music. And they would call. I was in the Army then. And they would take down the information at 4 o'clock when I got off duty. I would pick up the leads, call everybody back, and start booking bands that were buying Gibson and Ampeg equipment. And that evolved into over 200 local bands that I had semi-control of by 1968. And in the interim, Jack Alex, Jay the DJ, was starting to do shows at the Alexandra Roller Rink. They were Battle of the Bands. And Jack was booking lead acts. And as Teddy and Durwood have expressed, these bands, the pricing forced them out of the business. With Jack, there was no pricing because he was playing the records and the bands were coming in pretty much for gratis. So everything that went in to the till went into Jack, except what he had to pay out for expenses. So it was a productive time period during the early roller rink days, and that's where actually I got to learn about producing shows at the roller rink. And then when Durwood came along in 68, okay. And as he mentioned, some of the venues. But when he went to the roller rink, he contacted me because I knew where the fuse box was. That's a true story.
And the plug for the extension cords.
Exactly. And Durwood had a little different take on production, that he thought the bands ought to actually have a little respect, other than Jack's idea in those days, unfortunately, was, hey, you just go up there, sing your 3 minutes, we'll catch you later. So with Durwood, it was a whole different experience. We found, I think Eckington Scaffolding Company was the first scaffolding company, and we brought them in to actually build a stage out. Prior to that time, the stage consisted of, if you have any old pictures of the Alexandra Roller Rink, there was a big organ, and there was a little lip behind the in front of the organ. Then there was an area where you could skate, and beyond that skating area was a big bar to keep the skaters in. And what happened was there was boards put over that lip out to the bar, and it was about 12 to 14 feet deep, and that was what everybody worked on until Durwood and I started working. First show I think we did, if I remember right, was Janis Joplin and Jeff Beck opening, right?
Correct.
And the interesting thing about that night was Jeff Beck Rod Stewart was the lead singer.
Rod Stewart was the lead singer.
And we didn't, I don't know about you, I didn't know too much. I thought for the first half of the set that the blonde guy was Jeff Beck. So, but it was extremely successful. I remember we had 2 shows.
Correct.
And as everyone has read, Janice could be a little unsettling. And I remember we did the first show, cleared the hall, and I happened to be at the side stage door where the artists came in for the second show, and I don't know where Janice had gone, but the guard there didn't realize who she was, and she was ready to swing a silver Southern Comfort flask at him when I intervened, and we got her backstage. But the distinctive thing I remember about that second concert was I came in the side door, and as we kind of alluded to, that was the age of psychedelics or whatever, and I think at that particular point, pot was the drug of choice. And I walked in, and at first, I thought nobody was there. And I looked over, and there was 4,000, almost 4,000 people sitting cross-legged. The lights were down with a little bit of, atmospheric light. And I looked at 4,000 people sitting cross-legged just waiting for that show to start. And it was amazing. And from there, we did.
By the way, that was 4,000 people in a facility designed to hold 2,000 people.
20, yeah.
In the spirit of
Which-
Teddy Bodnar.
yeah.
It was.
And I'll jump ahead 1 second about that. As we know, Barry Richards and I went on and did shows in there, really successful shows. The Alice Cooper shows, the first, we were the second wave. And as Durwood is pointing out, the reason that came to a startling end, and I don't know, Mike, did you do the article? Barry Richards was interviewed by, I think it's either the Washington Post or the Evening Sun about music after we had, and he made the quote, this is the Fillmore East. What happened was the city fathers of Alexandria said, what is this? We have a Fillmore East in our neighborhood? And that was the beginning of the end. The fire marshals, who were all working for us, the off-duty police, who were all our buddies and working for us, all of a sudden turned on us. And it was capacity. Number one, it was capacity. And I know we had an Alice Cooper show in there and an afternoon and evening. And fortunately, I was head of the curve. We had to close the windows down. So the lighting, because Alice had, if you've ever seen his show, there was a lot of special effects. And we covered all of the windows in the roller rink for the 3 o'clock show. And fortunately, I knew enough to get fire retardant material to cover it. But we spent 15 minutes, I remember, with fire marshals trying to close us down and trying to burn this stuff. They had cigarette lighters holding this stuff off. Fortunately, they couldn't get it to burn. But shortly after that, it was the roller rink, the capacities came down so much, and we were paying for acts. So that was the end of that. And, from there,
Well, yeah, you had. I guess the thing that intrigues me so much about this is that it was like almost the Wild West. I mean, there really weren't that any rules like we know today regarding the concerts. You say people trying to burn down the curtains.
Well, that was the fire marshal. But no, this is.
Oh no, there was a culture.
Yeah.
I'm going somewhere with this.
There was a
No,
culture spawn. No, this always frosted me. Mainly because we were doing this as a business. And while there's a lot of love for what you're doing it for a business. And there's a culture, and I guess it's fair to say it was spawned by the hippie culture, if you will. And I say that with great affection for anybody who fancies himself a hippie. But that the music should be free. That the music belonged to the people. And there were folks who would gather outside the venues and chant, or I don't want to say riot because it wasn't quite that bad, but they would.
Wait a minute, Mike, want to differ with you on that.
Well, I mean, Mike is a friend of the party here, but it was always difficult. It's one reason you had security, aside from the regular folks who would try to just find their way in for free. There were those who felt that they should be allowed to come in for free just because they felt the music belonged to them. Now, where that comes from, I can't say. But
let me throw in the classic example of that was Mike Schreibman's Who show at Georgetown University, where it was a near riot, and you can talk about that, I'm sure.
Well, memories. Well, there was an organization of people who thought the music should be free, and they went as far as to print up tickets for the show and handed them out at colleges all over the area. And that night we had at least a few hundred, maybe more, people who were there demanding to be let in for free, and it was like a battleground. And I remember at the end of the night, our ushers or volunteer security people sitting on the floor all exhausted with broken glass all around them. And it's just, that was the first experience that Sam Lahamadou, who used to be a partner in Cellar Door, had ever had with a concert.
Well, all of us had probably have had riot experiences of some kind or another. And they get quite dangerous, but some they just kind of dissipate kind of on their own. But some of them,
Durwood,
some
on the
of them are
other
quite
side of
dangerous.
that, on 3 occasions, I had promoters pull guns on me.
Well,
One of them being Dickie Klotzman, his henchman Smothers, and the other 2 will remain unnamed, but there were a lot of guns around. And if you ever went to the Bayou in the old days and thought that those guys at the door were big, if you had seen what was under their shirts, and I'm not talking about their genital areas.
I think you are.
I'm talking about weapons. You would have been blown away, literally. There was the peace love contingent, but there was also the war contingent, and I can tell you because the infamous thing that happened to me in 1967 was walking back from doing a story on a group that was playing in Georgetown. I was attacked and I had a monkey wrench put through my skull. So I've got a steel plate in my head, and I had a bottle of Coke broken across my face because I had long hair. So there was the peace love contingent, but there was the war contingent. You also found that a lot of the peace love people who would come to the concerts who wanted in free could be pretty violent people themselves.
Well, we were also going through kind of a change in the time period. It was a very brief period where it was peace and love, and then it was nothing but the hostilities.
Well, I was lucky. At the Elks Club, I had a younger crowd. I was really like 16 to 18 was the crowd. And we had some rules that if you went outside, if you left the club, you couldn't even pay to come back in. And I remember one time we had a motorcycle gang, the Pagans, come there. They were all older. I was at the door. And I said, look, guys, I'll let you come in, but just remember, these are all kids. They came in, they walked around, they looked around, and they went back out. But my problems were on the Wilson line. And when you have problems on the Wilson line, you're out in the middle of the Potomac River. I stopped going on my own shows.
I have to tell you, go ahead and finish it, and I'll supplement.
I had Wilson Pickett, and they all just knew he wasn't going to show. And I'm sitting there taking money at the gate, and I hear them saying, if he doesn't show, we're going to sink this boat. Needless to say, I didn't go on the thing. But they were taking the fold-up chairs and tossing them overboard and stuff. I just stopped going on the boat. It scared me too bad.
When I first came to Washington, after my show at the Hilton, the jazz show, if you will, and Dionne Warwick was a wonderful artist, and it was more pop than jazz, but it was kind of across the board. I was recruited to help Waxy Maxey, who had very good access to Motown artists, and one particular group that was almost impossible to get was the Temptations. You just had to know somebody, and they were as popular as the Supremes almost, and we put them into Uline Arena. So you talk about the peace love group, and you talk about the war people. Then there are your hoodlums. I mean, they're there for nothing but to make a fuss. And we had 6,000 or 7,000 people in the Uline Arena for that concert, and it was a big deal. And it was in the same community that rode the Wilson line for you. And we had security guards who were not up to it, and we were told there were gunshots in the back of the hall. When the shots went off, everybody began to just depart. And they took off and they went down North Capitol Street and they busted in jewelry store windows, et cetera, et cetera. And it got reported on the national news on Huntley Brinkley the next night. So imagine it. We were not crawling out of that hole for a long time, but it was quite something.
You were actually, these were just, minor setbacks, I imagine, because you still stayed in the game. But talk about, I guess
I wasn't too bright.
But you actually, the whole idea, and I guess Durwood and everybody else can contribute as well. You basically had the halls. Nowadays, we know where the concerts take place and everything's pretty locked down. But back then, you had to basically shoehorn them in anywhere. Or in the case of Merriweather, I'm sure rock and roll wasn't on the agenda when they built the place, and so it just to go or the ballrooms.
Jeff, I get to claim credit for putting the first popular rock and roll concert in Merriweather Post Pavilion. Mike followed me, obviously, but we put Tiny Tim and Vanilla Fudge in Merriweather Post Pavilion that was built to be the summer home for the Washington National Symphony Orchestra. And I went out there and met with the guy who was running the place, a really nice fellow, and he had ties to the Boston Symphony Orchestra. His girlfriend was Paul Whiting's daughter or something like that. And I basically told him, you guys are not going to make any money if you don't put popular music in here. And Tiny Tim was fairly benign. Tiny Tim was a guy on a ukulele. So
Can you imagine a guy having the guts to book Tiny Tim?
Well, it was happening. It was a happening thing. Because the follow-on was Jimi Hendrix at the Merriweather Post Pavilion, and that was a big deal. It closed in a teeming thunderstorm. The lights went out. The concert ended with the rains coming down. But that was the first concert at the Merriweather Post Pavilion. Was
before
Tiny
Country Joe and Iron
Butterfly. Before that crowd, and the Doors. I don't know who brought the Doors to Merriweather also later that season, but the first concert was a Tiny Tim, and the second one was Jimi
But there's a
Hendrix
transition
in August of
Okay.
'68. Right.
And Carter Barron was doing rock shows.
Carter Barron was fading into the distance, and I think that's because the Felds basically abandoned the concert business.
I hate to say it.
Is that wrong?
Carter Barron, when I was growing up, I saw Danny Kaye,
Oh, wonderful.
Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. My parents took us to
Absolutely.
all of these unbelievably great shows, and then there was a short period of rock and roll coming in. But the one thing we haven't gotten to is the Washington Hilton Ballroom, which Durwood did the Doors there, and I was there, and during the concert, two guys jumped on stage. One was wearing a papier-mâché chicken head, and they were tackled by whoever. And the guy who wasn't wearing the papier-mâché chicken head now owns the premier rock and roll photo gallery on the East Coast, Govinda Gallery, Chris Murray.
Right.
And you just never know.
There was a time after I stopped doing shows at the Alexandria roller rink, which sort of transitioned over to Barry and Bud did shows there. There was a promoter whose name I never knew who tried to establish the Virginia Theater as a venue to do concerts as well, and I think it was fleeting. It just didn't last. They had a couple of shows, a couple of artists. If it doesn't hit, you don't keep doing it. And so I think they just packed up their bags and went back to where they came from. I don't know who they were.
I think Captain Beefheart was at the Virginia Theater. Is that somebody see that?
Debbie's got that.
Debbie, okay.
Yeah.
When was that?
Right.
January 30th, 1971. Captain
Right.
Alice Cooper and Wishbone Ash on the same
No.
at the Virginia Theater.
And that
But
was
that
the-
was you, Bud.
Yeah.
That was you. Okay.
That's Barry and I.
Okay.
That's what I said.
Yeah.
That's my archivist. Yeah, those were. It was a great. In fact, we've still got photos of Alice from that show, and it was a great. It was a theater. It was a proscenium theater, and it was a great place.
Well,
And
speaking of theaters, I want to speak briefly about the one and only concert that I was able to do at what could have been the premier theater in Washington. It was Lowe's Palace on F Street and 12th and F Streets Northwest. And it was one of those classic, ornate 1930s movie theaters that had boxes on the side and very high balcony. And I lobbied like crazy and pitched them on putting a concert in there. And it was a sensational event inside the theater. It was not so great outside the theater because of this crowd that wanted the free music. But that was a one and only, and it would have been a sensational place for downtown Washington.
Mike, didn't you do Warner? Weren't you Warner? Yeah, you can talk about that. That's still today is a great venue. But did you start the Warner? Who started the Warner?
The Warner had been closed for about 4 years, and it was a movie theater that opened in the 20s. And I talked the owner into letting me lease the place, and it was right after the '68 riots, and no businesses had moved back into D.C. during that time period. So what was the year that I started? It was '76, and we got all sorts of publicity because it was the first business that moved back. And I did a lot of wonderful shows there. 4 Nights of Little Feat, Bonnie Raitt, Emmylou Harris, Steve Miller.
But now the Hilton,
Well-
you mentioned
well,
that,
Jeff, and I think what you're getting at is, it was at the time a scramble to find a venue where you could produce a money-making concert. Teddy makes the point, you buy a band for $500, you can make some money if you put enough people in there, and if your radio is paid for by some DJ helping you out. When you are starting to pay in the $5,000 and $10,000 range for acts, you better get a place that can put enough people in there, and they better be a big enough draw for those people to show up. And so when I came to Washington and back to Arlington from New York, it was just beginning to ratchet up. The acts that were $500 were becoming $1,500 and $2,000 and $2,500. I believe I paid Jimi Hendrix $7,500 for 2 shows, and while that was a lot of money, he complained walking out of the hall that night. He personally, as we strolled out the same secret pathway that Ronald Reagan emerged from to get shot from, he turned to me and he said, "I should have been on a percentage tonight." And so that was one of those where I said, chalk one up for the promoters, and kept on marching.
It was only 6 months before that he played at the Ambassador Theater.
That's exactly right, as did The Who, I believe. And
The Who didn't play
The
there.
Who didn't play the
No.
Ambassador? Okay.
They went there the night that Jimi Hendrix played.
Oh, okay.
Jimmy
That's
was
right.
there for 5 nights, and he got $1,500 for the 5 nights.
For 5 nights. So for me, 6 months later, he got $7,500 for 2 shows on one day. And that was a flat. If he'd been on a percentage, he'd have probably doubled his money. The first I heard about pricing was when Robert Stigwood, who was manager for Cream, and I remember sitting in the box office with him in the Baltimore Civic Center, and his remark to me about looking at the manifest for the tickets as we were settling up, he says, "Oh, you had a $10 ticket here," which was kind of unheard of in 1969 to go as high as $10. And we began to hear prices, flat, the guaranteed prices for a band like the Bee Gees at $35,000 a concert. And this is after we're used to paying maybe $5,000 and $7,000, and you're saying to yourself, well, where am I going to take these folks where I can cover $35,000 plus the hall, plus the advertising, plus the services? And then you have to start asking yourself, can you sell enough tickets to cover this? Now, forget about the size of the hall. Can you sell? And I didn't believe in the Bee Gees at the time, so I was kind of incredulous to hear that. And then the percentages began to creep up. I mean, we used to settle on 50-50 deals, which was a classic wholesale retail margin. If you buy a thing for something to mark it up twice and sell it in a store, that's a classic wholesale retail formula. But they would creep up to 60%, 70%, 80%, and now I think the deals are they pay the promoters a flat fee and take everything after expenses. So I mean, it's simple as that.
To me, the beginning of the end of independent promoters, because I did spend a year working for Jack Boyle when I left the Washington Star, I went to work for Warner Electric Atlantic Corporation, which was the distribution arm for Warner Brothers Electric and Atlantic Records. Hated working for record companies. Jack Boyle hired me as his assistant. One day Jack said, you know, some of the acts I've got here, like Gordon Lightfoot, we're filling the place 6 nights a week. Why don't we do them one night in a concert hall? So Jack's first concert was Gordon Lightfoot Constitution Hall. And then Cellar Door grew and grew and grew into this monolithic organism, eventually getting the exclusive contract when the Capitol Center was built. I remember Jack tossed me the keys to his Mercedes, said, deliver this to Abe Poland. And it was a contract that barred anyone else from using the Capitol Center for music without going through Jack Boyle and Cellar Door Productions. And to me, that was really the death knell of independent promotion. And, you know, when I think now about a major concert being $200 for a good seat as opposed to $5 in those days, I don't think inflation and salaries have ratcheted up that much. It's greed and corporate America taking over the music industry, and I'm glad I'm not in it any longer.
Well, except the market supports it, Michael.
Well, I had the same experience with the House Lodge. When I wouldn't throw my first show until I had a meeting with all the people there, and I had the exclusive on it that no one besides myself could ever throw a rock and roll show at the House, because I was afraid I'd put the first show in and they'd take it over themselves.
Well, let me throw in one thing about the way groups cause tickets to go up. Because when I was working in Cellar Door, we were doing the Grateful Dead, the Capitol Center, and I was the guy who had to read the riders to the contracts. The basic contract was just a page or two. The rider could be 30 or 40 pages, and you won't believe this, but in the Grateful Dead's contract, it called for, this is for their road crew of about 90 people, filet mignon and lobster on fine china for lunch the day of the setup. So it was who can outdo the next act for a long time, especially in the early 70s. And the Grateful Dead thing just blew my mind.
Can I tell you, in 1969, my friend in New York and I would it was like we would collaborate. He would have a show in New York and I'd have it in Washington. We had a show in Baltimore. It was 3 acts: Cream, Moody Blues, and a singer named Terry Reid. Terry Reid was managed by Peter Grant, who was Led Zeppelin's manager and is legendary in the business. He was a decent guy. He's a rotund kind of guy, and a Brit through and through. And my friend and I spawned this strange idea. He in New York and I in Baltimore would go across the street to the Kentucky Fried Chicken and get a bucket of chicken and put it in the dressing room for these guys to come in. And I will never forget Peter Grant sitting there chewing on a drumstick saying, "You and your mate, you really know how to take care of us, don't you?"
That was the early days.
Yeah.
That was the early days. Jeff, let me just back
Sure,
up real
sure.
quickly, because there's kind of a timeline from my arrival back in Washington and starting in '67, and the nailing down of the Capitol Center in '71, I suppose, or '72.
Actually, it was 74.
In '74. So there's a lot of scrambling going on, and for me, the first thing I did was basically a social club show in the Hilton Ballroom with a fellow club owner and local entrepreneur, Mike O'Hara, which people may or may not know. He had an organization called JAPA that was for Junior Officer Professionals Association, and they would move from club to club, and he and I collaborated on a concert at the Hilton Ballroom. So it went okay. It didn't make any money, but the Hilton people were okay with it. So hence I come in with the Doors. Okay, we'll do it. Then there's Jimi Hendrix, and then we start scrambling for other venues, and that's when I moved over to the Alexandria Roller Rink, where I must have done a half a dozen shows, I guess, and tried to establish the notion of a Fillmore East without calling it that. Not that I had the foresight to recognize they wouldn't like it, but that was the purpose of that.
So the ballroom.
So the hotels were venues.
Right.
The hotel ballrooms were venues for largest crowds to be able to attend these concerts.
And they were with Jefferson Airplane in there, or was that?
Jefferson Airplane was in the Sheraton Park Hotel. That was in late '67. Bill Graham came through, and he did it in collaboration with the owners of the Cellar Door at the time, Tom Lyons and Charlie Fitchman. They asked me to promote it for them, and I did. And then the Hilton Ballroom, and then there was another facility. Then, of course, there was Uline Arena, but mostly those were rhythm and blues shows. I mean, the Temptations were a...
Now, was Jack Alex involved with that show, The Airplane? Is that the one with the...
No.
Where was the one?
He was the excuse me. Yeah, we talked about it. Here was the MC. Can I fill in some holes
Absolutely,
here?
please.
Okay. Let's go back to Cellar Door and Jack Boyle. Now, what happened there was you have to back up to Charlie Fitchman and Tom Lyons, who owned Cellar Door nightclub, and it was actually a concert venue before Jack got it. Jack, if I remember, Jack had the Crazy Horse. Wasn't he down at the Crazy Horse?
Jack had Max,
and
Crazy
Max.
Horse, and
Right.
a couple
He
of
was
other
he was a barman personally. Now, when you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding of everything, when Charlie Fitchman got tired, and he did get tired, and decided to move out on his yacht on the 3 mile limit, and sold the club to Jack, what he also sold him was a stack of contracts that Charlie had first play. He was one of the first people to put in a contract. If he played them, he had a return option on the contract. So when Jack took over, and were you there when Richard Pryor played the first time? Were you
only in the audience?
Okay, I was involved. Jack had just taken over shortly at that point, and he had all these contracts. He had to be, great guy, and I love him to death for a number of reasons, but he didn't know anything about half of the bands that were sitting in these contracts. But what he had is he had return options, and you're right. He looked at the return option for John Denver and said, hey, we can do John Denver in the Room for 5 nights, or I can do him at Constitution Hall for 1 and 3,800. And that's how, if you really go to the reality, in my mind, Charlie Fitchman created Cellar Door concerts by virtue of that, and Jack was a quick learner. And also he tied in with, as you mentioned, the late Sam Lahamadou, which is one of the nicest, most honest people I've ever met. So it was just a growth thing.
Unfortunately, it became oil and water between Jack and Sam, because I worked there when this mysterious attorney, Sam Lahamadou, I found out was a partner in the Cellar Door, brought his office in. My office was right in between Jack's and Sam's, and Jack would buzz me and say, do this, and Sam would buzz me and say, do the opposite. Sam also had the unique ability to call you at 6:30 in the morning, knowing that you had been at the club until 2 in the morning. It was craziness, but there's one funny story. When I first went to work at Cellar Door, I guess as my initiation, the bartenders were loading my drinks. So in a daze, I wandered upstairs. The offices were right above the club, and I passed out on Jack's leather couch in his beautiful brick-walled office. And I remember vomiting and remember then waking up in this vomit and saying, oh my God, who vomited here? And I went into Sam Lahamadou's office and fell asleep on his couch. Sam came in at 3 in the morning, he lived in Georgetown, to do the books. And he came into his office and I was asleep on his couch, and he shook me awake and he said, hey Mike, do you know who vomited in Jack's office? So, while Jack also just, I love Jack Boyle. I mean, Jack Boyle ended up selling Cellar Door concerts for $132 million. So you got to love a guy who started out really winning some of his clubs playing poker.
Right.
People never realized how smart a guy Jack was. He did his master's degree at the University of Madrid, but he liked coming off kind of as the bumpkin. I've never played gin rummy with somebody who could win every hand. Jack could. And Nissan Pavilion wouldn't be there if it wasn't for Jack Boyle.
So he has another, obviously a important name in the business. I think one thing, going back to the roller rink and some of the shows there, the one thing that I was intrigued with when I learned was when the Doors played. It was they were on, had played earlier in the day in Annapolis at the Armory, but they were literally on a bill with, it was like, how many other local bands? It was like a battle of the bands, and then the Doors. And so, can you talk? Who was putting on? You put on that show.
This predates me. This predates me at the Alexandria Roller.
This was my learning curve. What Jack Alex would do with these battle of the bands at the Alexandria Roller Rink is put them on the floor all the way around the rink, and each band would set up, and then there was a quote battle, and of course one of those bands won $100. But what was happening is fuses were blowing because everybody was plugging into a different wall socket, and you had bands, and then you couldn't see half of the bands. And the other thing was there was animosity between all these bands because everybody wanted to be the winner. So there was no camaraderie, and nobody was making any money. I put them together. We got the stage, and now what happened, you had 8 or 9 bands. You had the Hounds of Baskerville, Gary Scott and the Brookwoods, whoever. All of them after the show, when I was booking, if somebody called and needed a band for a homecoming, I go, oh, the Hounds of Baskerville, I don't know them. Well, they were on the show with the Doors. Oh, okay, boom, sold. And we had 12 bands that were all on the show with the Doors. And the Doors started that night at the Armory, National Guard Armory in Annapolis for Kirby. So we needed something, obviously, to keep everybody going till the Doors got there. So we had 8 or 10 local bands, and this was Thanksgiving Eve. We always did the night before. And so we kept playing, and then a guy named Nelson who worked for me, I never forgot, he had a Corvair. And he put the guys in the Corvair in Annapolis, drove them to the Alexander Roller Rink with a stop for Jim Morrison at a liquor store on that, whatever that route was, to get a 6-pack of Bud. He couldn't go any further. And came in to the roller rink, and we put him on. He did his show, and he did, in fact, we still got the interview somewhere. Speedy Reno, who was writing the columns, she got an interview backstage with Jim Morrison after that. But that was the whole concept of a lot of these shows was the local bands. We put the local bands to fill the night, and for Domestic Sound Productions, my thing, it was a tool that I could take 14 bands, stick them on a Neil Diamond show or stick them on a Yardbird show, and claim the next day that they were all headlining, and that's how it went.
I guess there were other. Clearly there were other promoters and other people doing this kind of thing that in this area. But I really do thank all 5 of you for being a part of this panel. I mean, I couldn't have done this. Is extraordinary to me that you were able to be here, and I can't thank you enough. I really, really appreciate it, as does the audience. And is there anything that you want to say? Final words, Durwood. You really were. You were right there, and you saw all these artists. And when we had a conversation originally, you were very kind to me. But I know this is really special to have you come out and participate.
Well, thank you for that. I just it was a really interesting and pretty exciting time, and it was really, in hindsight, it was a genuine transition from little tiny baby steps of music. The promotion business, of course, exploded in the next 10 to 20 years. It just turned into as so much in the country did. I mean, we didn't even realize we were living through a pretty significant transition in American life. Not to put too big a picture on it, but radio was changing. The riots had occurred, of course, the Vietnam War protests and all that stuff. But the music business suddenly just took off. And I guess the biggest motor behind that was the building of these big buildings around the country where these big acts could play and make all this money, and it just changed everything. And a lot of folks had
it's
good
amazing. The
participation in that.
transformation just endlessly fascinates
Right.
me, and you all had a front row seat right there at this.
Well, we were aware of it when you see the lines outside the door of the Hilton Ballroom leading up Connecticut Avenue and down what's the road, 8 Columbia Road, all the way to Adams Morgan to come into this show. You knew something was happening, and Elvis happened in that way. I guess the Sinatra phenomenon in the 40s was that way, and you began to see the crowds appear for these bands, and you said something was happening, and the music business was transforming in a significant way during those years and in the early 70s.
You went from groups touring the country in those packages that we talked about earlier,
Right.
where there were 5 or 10 groups on a show and they each played 20 minutes, to the groups being showcase artists and wanting the whole show for themselves. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying that the whole business changed.
I think one thing we've left out, we haven't mentioned the Birchmere and how important they are, not only to Northern Virginia, but to the world of that genre of music. And Seth Hurwitz and IMP Productions, because when Seth started with the 930 Club and Jack Boyle didn't jump on the kind of act Seth was booking, Seth built up IMP. So there's still some promoters here in the Washington area who found a niche market,
But
and they've worked it very well.
Seth fights for if he's got a major act, Seth has to fight to hold it into the Baltimore, Washington market against Live Nation offering him 30 cities and $5 million guarantees or whatever.
He does, but living
and that's
in
what killed the industry.
Living in Columbia, Maryland, with Seth having taken over Merriweather Post Pavilion, he's revitalized the concert scene there.
I think, I mean, this is really it's been a great source of oral history, which is really what I was hoping to do here. And I thank you all for being a part of this panel. And I do want to thank you all once again for being a part of this really special day.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thursday night, 7 till midnight at the Alexandria Roller Rink Arena. In person, the Wing Team presents Richard and the Young Lions.
Come on now and open up your door.
Plus, Bob Brady and the Concords.
Goodbye, baby.
Plus, the Chiffons.
Sweet talking guy.
On the same show, 10 of the area's greatest bands. It's a show, it's a dance, it's 5 solid hours of top entertainment this Thursday night at the Alexandria Arena on St. Asaph Street in Alexandria. Meet Wing Team Redcoats Bob Bruton, Ralph Robinson, Russ Wheeler, and Walt the Jones Boy in person. No school in Virginia the next day, so make your plans now for the Wing Team's All-Star Show and Dance Thursday night, November 3rd at the Alexandria Arena, St. Asaph Street in Alexandria, 7 till midnight.